The earth rejected the bodies. That's what the old-timers whispered when they found them. Twisted and wrong, buried in graves so shallow they seemed to push the coffins back to the surface every spring. Within the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian Mountains form a natural fortress against the outside world, there existed a bloodline so tangled that even nature itself refused to accept what it had become. The year was 1953, and the Korean War dominated headlines across America. But in Pike County, Kentucky, deep within a forgotten valley known locally as Harrow's Hollow, a different kind of horror was unfolding, one that had been festering for nearly a century. Since the 1860s, the Harrow family had lived in that isolated basin, their farmstead accessible only by a treacherous mountain path that became impossible during winter months. For generations, they had married within their own blood, creating a genetic nightmare that would eventually demand the attention of the outside world. It began with a scream echoing through the hollow on a frigid February morning. 18-year-old Martha Hensley, a postal worker making her first delivery route into the remote area, discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The small cabin she approached seemed normal enough from the outside, weathered wood and a sagging porch typical of mountain poverty. But when no one answered her knock, and the door swung open at her touch, Martha stepped into a scene that defied human comprehension. 7 people lived in that 2-room cabin. 7 people who shared not just a home, but a bloodline so intertwined that calling them a family seemed inadequate. What Martha saw that day would later be described in hushed tones by the county sheriff as a collection of human forms that barely resembled people at all. The eldest, a woman believed to be in her 60s but looking ancient beyond measure, sat motionless in a corner, her spine curved at an impossible angle, her skull misshapen and bulging on one side. Her eyes, set at different heights on her face, tracked Martha with an intelligence that somehow made the sight even more disturbing. 2 children, if they could be called that, huddled together on a filthy mattress. The boy, perhaps 10 years old, possessed arms of dramatically different lengths, the left one ending at his elbow in a malformed stump. His sister, her age impossible to determine due to severe developmental delays, made sounds that were neither words nor cries, but something in between. Her face bore the unmistakable signs of what mountain doctors had begun calling the Harrow features, a severely protruding lower jaw, eyes spaced so far apart they seemed to belong to different faces, and a skull that appeared too small for her body. Martha didn't make it past the threshold before she turned and ran, stumbling down the mountain path in a panic that nearly caused her to fall to her death 3 times. When Sheriff Tom Bradshaw finally made the journey up to Harrow's Hollow 2 days later, bringing with him a doctor from the county seat and a deputy who would quit his job within a week, they discovered that what Martha had witnessed was only the beginning of a horror story that stretched back generations. The Harrow family tree, as it would later be painstakingly reconstructed by university researchers, resembled less a tree and more a tangled knot of rope, looping back on itself again and again. Brothers had married sisters who were also their cousins. Fathers had taken their own daughters as wives when previous wives died. Children born of these unions grew up to marry their siblings, creating offspring whose genetic damage compounded with each generation. By 1953, the family had been practicing what geneticists would later term extreme consanguinity for at least 4 generations, possibly more. Dr. Robert Quincaid, a young physician fresh from his residency in Lexington, had never seen anything like what he encountered in Harrow's Hollow. His medical report, preserved in the Pike County archives, details findings that read like something from a medical textbook on genetic disasters. Of the 14 living Harrow family members discovered that February, not a single one was free from severe physical deformities. Mental impairments ranged from mild learning difficulties to profound cognitive disabilities that left individuals unable to speak or care for themselves. Several suffered from conditions Dr. Quincaid had only read about in medical journals: microcephaly, where the skull and brain failed to develop properly, severe skeletal abnormalities that left people unable to walk, facial deformities so extreme that eating and breathing required assistance. But perhaps most disturbing was the family's complete acceptance of their situation. They didn't see themselves as victims or sufferers. To them, this was simply how things were, how things had always been. The patriarch, a man in his 40s who went by the name of Ezra Harrow, explained to Sheriff Bradshaw with perfect calm that his wife Sarah was both his sister and his cousin, daughter of his father's brother, who had married their own sister. When asked if he understood that this was wrong, Ezra simply stared with his mismatched eyes and asked, "Wrong by whose measure?" "We're Harrows. We keep to our own." The investigation that followed would uncover a history so disturbing that even hardened law enforcement officials found themselves unable to sleep at night. The Harrow family had arrived in Kentucky in 1862, fleeing persecution in Virginia for reasons no one could quite remember anymore. The original Harrow brothers, Jacob and Isaiah, had brought with them two sisters, Ruth and Naomi. Within a year, both couples had married, each brother taking one sister as his wife. But here's where the genetic nightmare truly began. Ruth and Naomi were not just sisters. They were the daughters of their mother's brother, products of an earlier generation's consanguineous union. The isolation of Harrow's Hollow proved to be both blessing and curse. Protected from the outside world by natural barriers and deeply held suspicions of outsiders, the family multiplied in their secret valley. But with no new blood entering the line, the genetic pool grew smaller and smaller, more concentrated, more dangerous. By the 1890s, the effects were already visible. Photographs recovered from an old family Bible show people with increasingly severe facial asymmetries, unusual bone structures, and that distinctive vacant stare that suggested profound neurological damage. The winter of 1902 brought catastrophe. A brutal cold snap, remembered locally as the year the sky froze, trapped the Harrow family in their hollow for 4 months. When spring finally arrived, and the first outsiders ventured up the mountain path, they found a scene of horror. 8 people had died, most from preventable illnesses that their compromised immune systems couldn't fight off. But what truly shocked those first responders was discovering that the survivors had continued their pattern of intermarriage even as family members died around them. A teenage boy had married his own mother after his father perished. 2 siblings, both bearing obvious signs of genetic damage, had produced a child so deformed that it survived only 3 days. Because what you're about to witness in the coming chapters isn't just history. It's a descent into the darkest consequences of bloodline isolation that will change how you understand human genetics forever. By March of 1953, word of the Harrow family discovery had spread beyond Pike County, reaching the state capitol in Frankfort and eventually the offices of the University of Kentucky's newly established Genetics Research Department. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, one of the few female geneticists in the American South at that time, saw in the Harrow case an opportunity to study the real-world effects of sustained inbreeding in a human population, something that had been theorized but rarely documented with such clarity. Dr. Whitmore arrived in Pike County on March 23, bringing with her a team of 4 researchers, 2 social workers, and enough medical equipment to set up a makeshift examination facility in the county courthouse. What she found when she finally made the arduous journey up to Harrow's Hollow exceeded even her darkest expectations. In her private journals, later donated to the university archives, she wrote, "I have spent my career studying genetic abnormalities in controlled laboratory settings, examining chromosomes under microscopes, reading about hereditary conditions in textbooks. Nothing prepared me for the reality of what concentrated consanguinity does to a human population when left unchecked for generations. These aren't patients. They're living evidence of what happens when genetic diversity is eliminated entirely from a breeding population." The Harrow family by this point had grown suspicious of the outside attention. Ezra Harrow, despite his physical and cognitive limitations, possessed a cunning that came from generations of mountain survival instincts. He understood, perhaps better than the authorities did, that this attention would mean the end of their way of life. For 3 weeks he refused to allow any Harrow family member to be examined or removed from the hollow. He stood at the entrance to their property, a shotgun cradled in his malformed arms, and made it clear that outsiders weren't welcome. Sheriff Bradshaw faced an impossible situation. The law in 1953 didn't provide clear guidance for cases like this. No statute explicitly prohibited the kind of intermarriage the Harrows had practiced, and removing people from their property without their consent required evidence of immediate danger. But Dr. Whitmore, working with the county prosecutor, found a legal avenue: child endangerment. Of the 14 Harrows discovered that February, 5 were minors under the age of 16, and their conditions, medical experts agreed, constituted a form of harm that demanded intervention. On April 12, 1953, a convoy of vehicles made its way up the mountain path to Harrow's Hollow. Sheriff Bradshaw led the way, followed by 2 social workers, Dr. Whitmore and her team, and a judge from the county court who had agreed to make the journey to personally assess the situation. What transpired that day would later become the subject of intense legal and ethical debate, a conversation that continues in academic circles to this day. The confrontation lasted nearly 6 hours. Ezra Harrow, backed by his brothers and cousins, each bearing visible signs of their shared genetic heritage, refused entry to their property. But it was Sarah Harrow, Ezra's sister-wife, who finally broke the standoff in the most tragic way imaginable. Emerging from the cabin with her youngest child, a 4-year-old girl named Mercy, Sarah approached the assembled authorities with tears streaming down her face, which was pulled into a permanent grimace by a cleft palate that had never been repaired. "Take her," Sarah managed to say, her speech nearly incomprehensible due to her facial deformity. "Please take Mercy. She can't. She shouldn't. Please." In that moment, as Sarah held out her daughter, a little girl whose skull had grown in such a distorted way that one eye was nearly hidden beneath a bulge of bone while the other protruded unnaturally, the full tragedy of the Harrow bloodline became impossible to ignore. This mother, despite her own profound limitations, understood that what they had created in their isolated hollow was suffering beyond measure. The medical examinations that followed, conducted over the next 2 weeks in a converted warehouse in Pike County, revealed the full extent of the genetic catastrophe. Dr. Whitmore's team documented conditions that most medical professionals had only encountered in medical textbooks, if at all. Every single Harrow family member examined showed evidence of autosomal recessive disorders, conditions that only manifest when both parents carry and pass on the same defective gene, something that becomes statistically likely when couples are closely related. Microcephaly affected 6 family members, leaving them with abnormally small skulls and brains, resulting in severe cognitive impairments. 3 individuals suffered from achondroplasia in unusual presentations, causing dwarfism combined with other skeletal abnormalities. Cleft palates, both repaired and unrepaired, were present in 8 family members. Severe scoliosis had twisted spines into S-shapes and question marks. But beyond these visible conditions, blood work revealed even more disturbing findings: hemophilia in 3 male family members, a bleeding disorder that had likely caused the deaths of countless Harrow children throughout the generations, evidence of genetic damage to immune systems, leaving individuals vulnerable to infections that healthy bodies would easily fight off, and neurological abnormalities that suggested generations of brain damage compounding with each new birth. Dr. Whitmore's most significant finding, however, came from her construction of the Harrow family tree. Using church records, interviews with elderly residents who remembered the family from decades past, and testimony from the Harrows themselves, she pieced together a genealogical nightmare that would later be published in the Journal of Medical Genetics under a pseudonym to protect the family's identity. The coefficient of inbreeding, a mathematical measure of how genetically similar parents are, typically hovers around 0 for unrelated individuals. First cousins who marry have a coefficient of approximately 0.0625. The Harrow family members examined in 1953 showed coefficients ranging from 0.25 to 0.375, numbers that suggested genetic similarity closer to siblings or parent-child pairings repeated across multiple generations. The discovery that shocked even Dr. Whitmore, however, came from Ezra Harrow himself during a lucid moment in one of his interviews. When asked why the family had persisted in marrying within their own bloodline, even as the physical consequences became undeniable, Ezra provided an answer that revealed a twisted logic that had guided generations of Harrows. "My grandfather used to say that Harrow blood was special, that we couldn't let it mix with outsiders because outsiders would corrupt it, dilute it, make it weak. He said the deformities were tests from God, separating the truly chosen from the merely born. Those who survived childhood were meant to continue the line. The others." Ezra's voice trailed off, his mismatched eyes staring at something only he could see. "The others were buried up behind the cabin where the earth is soft." That casual mention of burials behind the cabin led to the most horrifying discovery of all. On April 29, 1953, investigators began excavating the area Ezra had indicated. What they found transformed the Harrow case from a medical curiosity into a criminal investigation that would shock the nation. The ground behind the Harrow cabin seemed to reject the shovels. That's how the excavation team would later describe it, their faces pale as they recounted the experience. Each time they dug down 2 or 3 feet, the earth would seem to push back, loose and sandy despite the surrounding clay. It was as if the mountain itself didn't want to reveal what had been hidden there for generations. By the end of the first day of excavation, they had discovered the remains of 19 individuals, most of them children. By the end of the week, that number had climbed to 43. The county coroner, Dr. James Murphy, a man who had served in the Pacific during World War II and thought he'd seen the worst of human tragedy, found himself unable to complete his examinations without frequent breaks. "These aren't normal burials," he told Sheriff Bradshaw, his hands shaking as he lit his 3rd cigarette in an hour. "These are bodies that were hidden, tucked away like shameful secrets. And the deformities, God help us. The deformities make the living heroes look blessed by comparison." Indeed, the skeletal remains told stories that would have been unbelievable if the evidence weren't literally buried in the Kentucky clay. Infants with skulls that had never fully closed, suggesting hydrocephalus so severe they couldn't have survived more than days. Children whose bones showed evidence of rickets combined with skeletal dysplasias that made their limbs grow at wrong angles. Teenagers whose pelvic structures were so malformed that, in the case of females, childbirth would have been a death sentence. Each burial represented not just a death but a genetic catastrophe, a life that the Harrow bloodline had created and then couldn't sustain. Dr. Whitmore's analysis of the remains provided the final piece of the puzzle. Using the relatively new field of osteological analysis, examining bone development and pathology, she was able to estimate that the burial spanned approximately 70 years, from the early 1880s through the 1950s. The rate of infant and child mortality in the Harrow family was nearly 70%, more than 7 times higher than the already elevated rates seen in impoverished Appalachian communities. But what made this data truly significant was the pattern it revealed. With each generation, the mortality rate increased, the deformities became more severe, and the age of death decreased. The Harrow bloodline was literally destroying itself, becoming less and less viable with each passing year. The public reaction, when news of the discoveries finally broke in newspapers across Kentucky and eventually reached national attention, ranged from horrified fascination to righteous anger. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a front-page story on May 15, 1953, with the headline, "Mountain Horror, Decades of Inbreeding Create Living Nightmare in Pike County." The article, written with the sensationalism typical of the era, focused on the most shocking details: the cemetery of deformed children, the living family members whose physical appearance shocked visitors, and the implications of generations of what the article delicately termed inappropriate unions. But amid the sensationalism, serious questions emerged that still resonate today. Who was responsible for allowing this situation to develop over decades? Local authorities had known about the isolated Harrow family for years, yet no one had investigated. Churches that preached against various sins had somehow overlooked the obvious genetic consequences playing out in their community, and doctors who had occasionally treated Harrows for various ailments had apparently never reported the patterns they must have observed. The legal proceedings that followed became a landmark case in Kentucky family law. Prosecutor Daniel Hartman faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you charge people for actions that, while morally reprehensible, weren't explicitly illegal at the time they occurred? Marriage between first cousins was legal in Kentucky in 1953, and even closer relationships, while socially taboo, didn't violate state statutes in ways that were clearly prosecutable. Instead, Hartman focused on child endangerment charges against Ezra Harrow and 2 of his brothers, arguing that knowingly conceiving children within such a concentrated genetic pool constituted a form of harm. The trial, held in the Pike County Courthouse in June of 1953, became a media spectacle. Reporters from as far as New York and California descended on the small Kentucky town, filling the courthouse and the surrounding streets. But it was the testimony from the Harrow family members themselves that proved most compelling and disturbing. Sarah Harrow, speaking through an interpreter who could understand her damaged speech, described a childhood where marriage between siblings was presented as not just acceptable but preferable. "We were told that Harrow blood was pure," she testified, her disfigured face making even the seasoned reporters look away. "That mixing with outsiders would corrupt us, make us weak. We were taught that the deformities were marks of being chosen, special. It wasn't until I held Mercy the first time, saw what we'd done to her, that I understood we'd been lied to for generations." Before we continue with what happened to the Harrow family in court, I need you to understand something crucial. The next revelation will make you question everything about family, genetics, and the secrets that communities keep. Type in the comments, "The Earth remembers what families forget." Because in the final chapters, you'll discover that the Harrow case wasn't unique, and that the legacy of their bloodline extended far beyond the Kentucky Hollow in ways that still impact lives today. Dr. Whitmore's expert testimony provided the scientific foundation for the prosecution's case. Standing before the jury with charts and photographs that made several jurors visibly ill, she explained in clear, precise language what happens when a population breeds exclusively within itself for multiple generations. Imagine, she said, that each of us carries approximately 10 to 15 recessive genetic mutations. In normal circumstances, these mutations never express themselves because we partner with individuals who carry different mutations. Our genetic diversity protects us. But when close relatives reproduce, the probability of both parents carrying and passing on the same harmful mutations increases dramatically. After several generations of this pattern, you don't get one or two genetic disorders in a family. You get a cascading failure of human genetics itself. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney Robert Mills, faced an impossible task. How do you defend people who had clearly caused immense suffering yet had done so within a framework of belief that they genuinely thought was correct? Mills focused his defense on ignorance rather than innocence, arguing that the Harrows were victims of their own isolation, products of a culture that had developed in complete separation from modern medical knowledge and social norms. These people, he told the jury, aren't monsters. They're the tragic result of geographic isolation and generational ignorance. They genuinely believed they were doing right by keeping their bloodline pure. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, they delivered a verdict that satisfied no one but represented a legal compromise, guilty of child endangerment, but with sentences that emphasized forced relocation and education rather than lengthy imprisonment. Ezra Harrow and his brothers each received 5-year suspended sentences contingent on agreeing to move out of Harrow's Hollow and submit to ongoing monitoring by social services. More significantly, the judge issued an order that would forever change the surviving Harrow family. All minor children were to be removed from family custody and placed in specialized care facilities where their medical needs could be properly addressed. The screams from Sarah Harrow when they took Mercy and the other children echoed through the courthouse and haunted everyone present for years afterward. This wasn't the cry of a criminal losing a legal battle. This was a mother, despite all her limitations, having her children torn away. Even those who firmly believed in the necessity of the court's decision found themselves shaken by the raw agony in that sound. The breaking apart of the Harrow family in the summer of 1953 marked the end of one horror, but the beginning of another kind of tragedy. The 14 surviving Harrows were scattered across Kentucky, placed in various institutions, hospitals, and, in the case of the younger children, foster homes willing to take on the extraordinary challenges these children presented. The cabin in Harrow's Hollow was burned to the ground on July 4, 1953, by order of the county health department, which declared it a biohazard beyond salvaging. 43 bodies from the cemetery behind the cabin were exhumed and given proper burials in the Pike County Cemetery. Their graves were marked with simple stones that bore only dates, no names, a final anonymity for children who had never had a chance at normal life. But the story of the Harrow bloodline didn't end with that dispersal. In fact, in many ways, it was only beginning to reveal its full scope. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, now committed to understanding the full extent of the genetic damage wrought by generations of extreme consanguinity, continued her research. What she discovered in the following months would challenge everything the medical community thought they knew about the limits of human genetic resilience. Among the Harrow children placed in institutional care, a disturbing pattern emerged. Despite being removed from the Hollow and given access to modern medical care, nutrition, and education, the genetic damage proved largely irreversible. Mercy Harrow, the 4-year-old whose mother had begged authorities to take her, underwent 3 corrective surgeries in her first year of placement, attempting to address the most severe of her cranial deformities. The surgeries were technically successful, but Mercy's cognitive development remained profoundly impaired. By her 5th birthday, she could speak only a handful of words and would never progress beyond that point. Similar outcomes repeated across the dispersed family. Of the 14 living Harrows removed from the hollow, 9 would die before reaching the age of 40. The causes varied: infections that healthy immune systems would have easily fought off, organ failures that suggested systemic genetic problems, and, in 3 heartbreaking cases, complications from conditions that doctors had never seen before and didn't know how to treat. The Harrow bloodline, it seemed, had been damaged beyond medicine's ability to repair. But Dr. Whitmore's most significant discovery came not from studying the Harrows themselves, but from investigating their extended family network. In October of 1953, following leads provided by elderly residents who remembered the Harrow family before their complete isolation, Whitmore discovered that the family had distant relatives scattered throughout eastern Kentucky and neighboring West Virginia. These families had branched off from the Harrow line in the late 1800s, before the practice of extreme inbreeding had taken full hold. Their descendants showed a spectrum of genetic issues, less severe than the Harrow family proper but still present and identifiable. In a small town called Prestonburg, Kentucky, Whitmore found the Cordial family, descendants of a Harrow sister who had married outside the bloodline in 1889. They showed relatively normal physical development, but family records revealed a pattern of infant deaths and birth defects that, while not as extreme as the main Harrow line, still suggested the lingering effects of that shared genetic heritage. In Huntington, West Virginia, another branch of the family tree revealed similar patterns. The genetic damage caused by those early generations of inbreeding had created a legacy that extended far beyond Harrow's Hollow, touching the lives of people who didn't even know they carried the tainted bloodline. This discovery led Whitmore to a disturbing conclusion that she detailed in her groundbreaking 1955 paper, Multi-Generational Effects of Sustained Consanguinity in Isolated Populations. The paper, which would influence genetic counseling practices for decades to come, argued that the effects of inbreeding don't simply disappear when fresh genetic material is introduced. Instead, the damage persists through generations, creating what she termed genetic shadows that can express themselves unexpectedly in descendants who believe themselves unaffected by their ancestors' practices. Meanwhile, back in Pike County, the community struggled with the aftermath of the Harrow case. The national attention had painted the region as backward and primitive, a stereotype that Appalachian communities had long fought against. Local leaders worked to distance themselves from the Harrows, emphasizing that the family was an extreme outlier, not representative of mountain culture, but the damage to the region's reputation had been done. For years afterward, Harrow became a slur, a word used to mock or demean anyone from the mountain regions. Yet, amid the controversy and pain, some good emerged. The Harrow case prompted Kentucky to strengthen its marriage laws, implementing blood tests for marriage licenses and requiring genetic counseling for couples who were closely related. Medical schools began teaching the case as an example of why genetic diversity matters in human populations, and organizations dedicated to helping children with severe genetic conditions received increased funding and attention, partly due to the public awareness generated by the Harrow tragedy. In 1958, 5 years after the initial discovery, Dr. Whitmore returned to Pike County for a final research trip. She wanted to document the long-term outcomes for the Harrow family members and to see what had become of that isolated hollow where so much suffering had occurred. The path up the mountain had been deliberately destroyed, discouraged by local authorities who wanted no one visiting what had become known as Devil's Hollow in local parlance. But Whitmore, now in her mid-50s and determined to complete her research, made the difficult hike anyway. What she found shocked her even more than the original discovery had. The hollow hadn't remained empty. Nature had reclaimed the space where the cabin had stood. But more disturbing was evidence that someone had been visiting the site. Fresh flowers had been placed where the cemetery had been, though the bodies had long since been moved. Crude markers had been set up bearing names and dates that Whitmore recognized from her research. Someone, perhaps one of the Harrow family members or a distant relative, had been coming to the hollow to remember those who had died there. In her final field notes from that trip, Whitmore wrote, "I came here expecting to find abandonment, a place forgotten by human memory as it has been reclaimed by nature. Instead, I found evidence of remembrance. Someone still mourns for the Harrows, still marks the place where they lived and died." This raises the question that has haunted me throughout this research. Are the Harrows victims or villains? Did they choose their fate, or were they prisoners of circumstances beyond their control? I'm not certain I'll ever have a satisfactory answer to that question. By 1960, of the 14 Harrows removed from the Hollow in 1953, only 7 remained alive. Ezra Harrow had died in 1957 of pneumonia, his damaged immune system unable to fight off an infection that antibiotics should have easily treated. Sarah Harrow survived until 1959, but her death certificate listed the cause as organ failure due to multiple congenital abnormalities. Mercy Harrow, the little girl whose mother had begged authorities to save her, lived in a state institution until her death in 1962 at the age of 13. Despite 8 years of the best medical care available at the time, she had never progressed beyond the developmental level of a toddler. The final 3 surviving Harrows from the original 14 lived into the 1970s, but their lives were marked by constant medical interventions, social isolation due to their appearances, and the psychological trauma of being living reminders of one of America's most disturbing genetic disasters. The last surviving Harrow, a woman named Rebecca, who had been 12 years old at the time of the family's discovery, died in 1978 at the age of 37. She had lived in assisted care her entire adult life, never able to work or live independently due to her physical and cognitive limitations. The true scope of the Harrow family tragedy didn't become fully apparent until decades after the first discovery in 1953. As genetic science advanced through the 1970s and 1980s, researchers returned to Dr. Whitmore's original data, now able to analyze it with tools and understanding that didn't exist during her lifetime. What they discovered painted an even more disturbing picture of what extreme consanguinity can do to a human population. In 1984, Dr. Marcus Chen, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University, published a retrospective analysis of the Harrow family case using new methodologies for estimating genetic diversity. His findings were startling. The genetic variation within the Harrow family by 1953 was less than what would typically be found within a single individual. They had effectively created a genetic monoculture where everyone was so genetically similar that their bodies couldn't distinguish self from family member at a cellular level. This lack of diversity explained many of the health issues that had plagued the family. Their immune systems couldn't function properly because they lacked the genetic variation necessary to recognize and fight off diverse threats. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Harrow case emerged from genetic testing conducted in the early 2000s. Researchers working with permission from distant Harrow descendants who had no direct connection to the inbred line discovered that the genetic damage from those generations of extreme consanguinity could still be detected in the DNA of people born nearly a century after the most intense period of inbreeding. Certain genetic markers associated with the conditions that had devastated the Harrow family showed up at elevated rates in descendants, even when those descendants had no obvious physical or cognitive impairments. This finding revolutionized understanding of how genetic damage persists across generations. It wasn't enough to simply introduce new genetic material. The harm caused by generations of inbreeding had created permanent changes to the family's genetic code that would take many, many generations to fully dilute. The Harrow bloodline would carry the consequences of those decisions made in the 1800s well into the 21st century and beyond. The physical location of Harrow's Hollow itself has become something of an unofficial memorial, though one that few visit. The path up to the Hollow was never fully restored, and local authorities actively discourage visits, partly out of respect for the tragedy that occurred there, partly because the site still carries a stigma that the community would prefer to forget. But occasionally, usually around the anniversary of the discovery in February, someone makes the difficult hike up to where the Harrow cabin once stood. In 2003, on the 50th anniversary of the discovery, a small group of genetic researchers, historians, and descendants of the extended Harrow family made a pilgrimage to the Hollow. They brought with them a memorial plaque, which they installed at the site despite the lack of official authorization. The plaque reads, "In memory of those who lived and died in this place. May their suffering teach us the value of genetic diversity and the danger of isolation." 1862 to 1953. The ceremony that day was somber and brief. One of the attendees, Dr. Patricia Harrow Mills, a distant descendant who had become a genetic counselor partly inspired by her family's history, spoke about what the Harrow case meant to modern genetics. "For too long, we talked about the Harrows as if they were a cautionary tale, a horror story to scare people into understanding genetics. But they were people, flawed, misguided certainly, but people nonetheless. People who suffered because of decisions made generations before they were born. The real lesson of the Harrow family isn't about the dangers of inbreeding, though that's certainly part of it. The real lesson is about the importance of connection, of community, of not allowing isolation, whether geographic or ideological, to cut populations off from the broader human family. Today, the Harrow case remains a cornerstone of genetic education. Medical students study it to understand the practical consequences of consanguinity. Genetic counselors reference it when discussing the importance of genetic diversity with patients, and anthropologists examine it as an extreme example of how isolation can affect human populations. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a reminder of the importance of community oversight and intervention when vulnerable populations are at risk. The final chapter of the Harrow story, in many ways, is still being written. In 2019, a team of anthropologists and geneticists from the University of Kentucky proposed a comprehensive study of remaining Harrow descendants, hoping to use modern genetic sequencing to fully map the extent of damage caused by those generations of extreme inbreeding. The study, controversial from its inception due to privacy concerns and the stigma still attached to the Harrow name, remains in the planning stages. But the impact of the Harrow case extends beyond academic research. In communities across Appalachia and other isolated regions, the story serves as a catalyst for conversations about the importance of genetic diversity, access to health care, and the dangers of geographic and social isolation. Programs have been established to ensure that no family suffers the same fate as the Harrows, with genetic counseling services, health outreach programs, and education initiatives designed to break down the isolation that can lead to such tragedies. The bodies the earth rejected. That's how this story began, with the discovery that even nature itself seemed to rebel against what the Harrow bloodline had become. But perhaps the earth didn't reject those bodies out of disgust or judgment. Perhaps it was trying to force acknowledgement, to push evidence of human suffering back to the surface where it couldn't be ignored or forgotten. The shallow graves that wouldn't stay buried, the twisted forms that nature seemed to reject, were really nature's way of demanding that we face the consequences of isolation and genetic concentration taken to their most extreme conclusion. The Harrow family is gone now. The last direct descendant of that inbred line died decades ago. The hollow where they lived has been reclaimed by forest and time. But their legacy remains, written in medical textbooks, whispered in genetics lectures, and remembered in the DNA of distant relatives who carry faint echoes of that genetic catastrophe. It's a legacy that challenges us to think about family, community, and the invisible threads of heredity that connect us all. It reminds us that we are not meant to exist in isolation. That human diversity isn't just a social good, but a biological necessity. If you've made it this far, you understand why this story needed to be told. Not to sensationalize suffering, but to honor those who endured it and to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. This channel exists to bring light to the darkest corners of human history, to educate through understanding the real consequences of genetic isolation. If this story impacted you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to understand why genetic diversity and community connection matter. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're warnings from the past that remain relevant today. The Harrow family paid an unimaginable price for generations of isolation and inbreeding. May we learn from their suffering, and may we never allow such a tragedy to repeat itself.